this formation. I would not create a long. I will just tell you that if you want to, you should look up at the website in library, the dissertation, which he's got locked down, but not secure. And it is called, in the spirit of Christians, dissertation is called Climate Impacts, Fossil Hegemony and Modern Crisis of Imagination. And as we know from earlier today, Casey introduced himself as having finished this dissertation with Michael Hart, a person working closely with him. And today, he's going to speak of the anthropologies of climate change. Please welcome Casey to this conference.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the entire Math 2 Editorial Collective for inviting me to speak. It's really a great honor to be here and to get to be in conversation with so many people whose work I really respect and admire very much. So this is going to be some reflections on some new things I'm thinking about. I think it's going to be in conversation with Christian. And hopefully provocative, but not too provocative. So for over a decade, discussions of climate change in the academic humanities have centered on the representational dilemmas posed by anthropogenic warming, often with an eye towards identifying the images, stories, genres, and modes of analysis that might help us to think through this physically massive and emotionally overwhelming crisis. Climate change is a crisis of imagination that demands new kinds of imaginative effort, the thinking goes, from visualizing civilizational collapse to speculating about the agency of the non-human. The aim of this effort is to make the abstract concrete. An article published on Princeton's website last year, titled "Can the Humanities Help Solve Climate Change?" quotes Rob Nixon. The central question, Nixon suggests, is how do we turn the abstractions of data into animated stories and images that can move people? This is a frequently asked question, and it's an important one. Yet in the academic humanities, as much as in the vast gray literature churned out by NGOs, development banks, activist groups, and so on, overstating the stakes of climate change's representational dilemmas and over-investing in concrete representations as a means of moving people carries intellectual and political risks. Perhaps counterintuitively, one risk is that we credit climate change with too much, that we overstate its role in determining human affairs while losing sight of the political and economic forces that ultimately determine what climate change is, it looks like. So I want to first talk briefly about how researchers determine what climate change's role is in causing extreme weather events like if it doesn't work, that's okay.
Maybe you need to aim it. I don't know. I'm just going to. I see it. See something happening behind. There. Yes. Try. There.
So the clicker is not. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I first want to talk briefly about how researchers determine what climate change role is in causing extreme weather events. There are several methods of extreme weather attribution, and the most advanced, called fractional attributable risk, or FAR, is richly textured. Confirming Paul Edwards' observation that what we know about climate change we know from models, the method uses observational and historic climate data to spin up models of two scenarios. One scenario models climate patterns as if greenhouse gas concentrations had not increased since the mid-19th century. Another models climate patterns as if those concentrations had increased at the same rate as they did in our world. Drawing explicitly on Humean causality, researchers mostly use FAR to draw conclusions about necessary causation, i.e., Y would not have occurred in the absence of X. And they do so to make stochastic claims. For instance, that Hurricane Harvey's deluge over Houston was 3 times more likely in our world than one where the steam engine remained a sketch in Watt Snowflake. This counterfactual modeling method takes up to the particular disasters as metonymic representations, not only of climate change in the present, but also of the dystopian future we've come to fear. When applied to the social catastrophes that often attend extreme weather events, and which define those events in the public imagination, reading exclusively for climate can thus support a kind of climate determinism, or what climatologist Mike Holm calls the tendency to, quote, reduce the future to climate. And this tendency has partly to do with the motivations animating attribution claims. Researchers developed the counterfactual method under pressure from journalists, policymakers, and climate campaign groups who wanted to confidently blame this hurricane or that wildfire on climate change, on the view that doing so could help them to persuade the public that climate change is real. Longer term, campaign groups hope to use attribution research to bring successful lawsuits against major greenhouse gas emitters, to hold them legally liable for their contributions to quantifiable losses and damages caused by climate change. So the juridical and political function of extreme weather attribution, especially as it travels beyond the scientific community, is not to determine the full range of causes of a particular disaster. The function is to narrativize particular weather events as climate disasters in an effort either to assign blame or to make a crisis mystified by the abstractions of data more present, proximate, and visible. And doing so can seem politically urgent, especially in the US context. In the spring of 2021, Time magazine published a cover bearing an image of 50,000 matchsticks arranged in the shape of the continents, portions of which are aflame. The headline, "Climate is Everything," tells us how to read the argument made by the image, that while climate change's effects may now seem localized to certain familiar hotspots, catastrophe is coming for the entire planet. There's a lot we could say about the geography of disaster presented here, but there's nonetheless a reason this cover makes sense. Climate change has become an object of consensual concern. The claim that climate is everything, because the effects of climate change are seen to be everywhere, has become a tendentially dominant way of narrating climate change, even in the US, especially but not exclusively among those who understand themselves to be on the right side of the issue. Climate change is, quote, the overriding story of our time, as the former editor-in-chief of the Columbia Journalism Review put it. And telling this story well is seen as a condition of salutary action by the groups loosely composing what we might call the climate movement. Yet the rhetoric of the Time cover appears in unexpected places. It echoes, on the one hand, the rhetorical posture of Greta Thunberg, face of the youth climate movement, who consistently upbraids world leaders for failing to treat climate change as a global emergency. On the other hand, it's perfectly compatible with the position of the US Department of Defense, which has, at least since 2006, treated climate change as a perfect storm, multiplying security threats in theaters across the globe. So this alignment tells us something about the ambivalence of assigning climate change the status of overriding story. And this ambivalence is central to what I'm thinking of as the anti-politics of climate change. And I'm sort of cribbing this term from geographer Eric Swingadow, who's thinking with Mouffe, Zizek, and Rancière about the collapse of politics into administration after the fall of the Soviet Union. In a 2012 essay on the non-political politics of climate change, Swing et al. Argues that the more climate change becomes an object of public concern, the more the properly political, by which he means class conflicts, that define the climate issue fade from view. The meaning of climate change becomes fixed within the coordinates of a narrative arc that follows the carbon from the tailpipe to the stratosphere, where growing concentrations of CO2 trap solar heat and scramble planetary weather patterns in ways that are invariably figured as catastrophic, if not apocalyptic. Reducing climate change to a problem of atmospheric chemistry invites the familiar sorts of techno-managerial interventions like carbon pricing and carbon capture that can, and in a sense, must be deployed without contesting how social power is exercised or legitimated. I use the term anti-politics as a way to acknowledge that simply asserting the existence of climate change registers as a political act in the US context, because it contradicts the lingering denialism of the fossil fuel industry and its allies on the right. But it is a political act that can suspend politics when it affirms the sort of climate determinism implied by the counterfactual modeling, and with the emergency logic that subtends the idea of climate as overriding story ultimately appears to demand action without deliberation. So the charge of anti-politics is another way of asking what exactly the climate story might be overriding. So my case study here is the Syrian civil war, a conflict you're likely familiar with. Reports that climate change had significantly contributed to Syria's civil war started to circulate in 2015, as Syrian refugees were streaming into southern Europe, and delegates were preparing to convene in Paris for the 15th Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Convention. Sources ranging from the Scientific American to Bernie Sanders to Bashar al-Assad declared that climate change had partly caused the crisis unfolding in Syria, a contention supported by research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the story went like this. Anthropogenic warming had worsened droughts across the Eastern Mediterranean beginning in 2006, displacing 1.5 million people in northeastern Syria, fueling urban unrest that exploded into civil war in 2011, ultimately sending migrants to Europe and provoking nativist backlash. Al Gore, in fact, later suggested Syria's climate war was responsible for Brexit. In 2015, though, ahead of the much anticipated Paris Climate Summit, politicians, activists, and journalists pointed to the Syrian civil war as a reason nations needed to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and as a grim portent of the upheavals to come if they did not. But the evidence was always very thin. The PNAS study investigating the link between climate change and the Syrian civil war did not definitively prove that anthropogenic warming had played a significant role in causing Syria's 2006 and 2008 droughts. And the evidence linking drought to migration from northeastern Syria to its cities was exaggerated, according to political scientist Jan Selby, published the first of several studies refuting the Syria climate conflict thesis with colleagues in 2017. Climate change may have played some role in the droughts, the paper acknowledged, but the decisive groundwork for war was laid around 2000, when Assad's regime pulled the plug on key agricultural subsidies and opened the Syrian economy to global markets, causing fuel, fertilizer, and food prices to spike. Underlying this crisis was the legacy of French colonialism, US adventurism in Iraq, and a protectionist regime colliding with a global economic order disciplined by neoliberal institutions like the World Bank. Even if climate change had significantly worsened Syria's 2006 and 2008 droughts, according to Selby and his colleagues, as well as Marwa Dawoodi in a separate book, the Syrian civil war was fundamentally not a climate war. But even today, this narrative overdetermines accounts of the war in the popular press and in the NGO and activist literature. So what should we make of this dispute? An initial lesson might be that what we think we know about climate change, like any other socially mediated object of knowledge, demands to be subjected to rigorous and ongoing critique. Scholars in the humanities have increasingly turned their attention to climate change. Much of their work attempts to diagnose and overcome the crisis of imagination, presumed to lie at the heart of what Imre Zeman and Dominic Boyer call climate impacts, or the confounding absence of serious carbon controls, despite overwhelming evidence confirming the need for rapid decarbonization. The causal complexity of events like the Syrian civil war suggests that the humanities' engagement with climate questions ought to focus not only on understanding the ethical stakes and aesthetic dimensions of planetary change, but also on historicizing and challenging dominant narratives of climate change as these harden into doxa, even when that doxa seems to align with our political commitments. This might seem like an entirely self-evident point, but it runs directly counter to the climate Leninism proposed by Andreas Malm on the left wing of the climate movement, who argues that the urgent need to slash emissions leaves no time for deliberation. It also challenges the post-critical turn in the humanities, which resonates with a depoliticized politics of knowledge that responds to the inflated threat of climate denial by granting certain ways of thinking about climate change immunity from critique. We see this, for instance, in the work of Naomi Oreskes, who has argued that historians of science ought to spend less time studying how climate facts are constructed and more time studying how they are deconstructed by cynical skeptics. Indeed, post-critique emerges alongside the specific anxiety expressed most famously by Latour, that the critical impulse to deconstruct knowledge is too compatible with the tactics of the far right as it advances its agenda on climate, not by manufacturing consent, but by reflexively questioning the legitimacy of any claims to the truth. Implied by the turn away from critique, then, is the belief that producing a stable, shared understanding of the truth is a condition of salutary political intervention. This belief has become articulated to the self-described progressive political identity in the US, evidenced by events like the 2017 March for Science and films like Adam McKay's 2022 Don't Look Up. In this context, the injunction to believe science or believe scientists has as much to do with learning the explanatory power of the scientific method as it does with identifying oneself as a member of a particular community of belief, one that sees itself as being on the same rational, fluid, or progressive side of an issue that seems to have potentially existential stakes. This combination of emergency rhetoric, post-critical thinking, and a certain kind of identity politics helps to account for the emphasis we place on telling clear stories about representative climate disasters, even when doing so downplays the role of equally more significant political and economic forces. For critics of climate determinism, like Holm and Selby, the main problem with treating climate change as the object cause of political and economic disasters, especially wars and migrations, is that it pushes these other forces out of the frame. In the case of disasters in the global south, especially, the enduring effects of colonialism, post-colonial nation building, neoliberal development, and US war making can quickly disappear behind the climate change story, especially when the story is told simply and succinctly, footnoting the dilemmas of a world shaped by inequalities between nations, classes, ethnic groups, and so on. Blaming climate change is sometimes a transparent dodge. In one telling example, the International Crisis Group reports that at the height of the Syrian civil war, Bashar al-Assad would bring diplomats to drought-stricken regions and tell them, quote, it all has to do with global warming. It can also be a not so transparent dodge. In the case of the occupied West Bank, the United Nations, Oxfam, and the World Bank have all reported that rainfall changes caused by climate change have made it harder for Palestinians to collect drinking water. While this is almost certainly true, it is, of course, the Israeli occupation and not climate change that remains the principal cause of Palestinian water stress. So much so that a 2022 account contends that compared to the current situation, a Palestinian rights plus climate change scenario results in a net increase in per capita water availability for Palestinians in the West Bank compared to today. In other words, even as climate change worsens, Palestinians' access to water could actually improve if Israeli occupation ended. Focusing principally on climate change's role in causing political and economic disasters can also stoke fears already circulating in the North American and European right that climate change will unleash waves of climate refugees, especially from the Middle East and North Africa, tapping into reactionary anxieties about white demographic decline, emphasizing climate change's role in driving migration, not only elides other often less tractable causes, but also lends rhetorical support to militarized, isolationist, or overtly nativist responses, This is by now a familiar argument. Andrew Baldwin, Neil Ahuja, Betsy Hartman, and others have argued that casting climate change as what the DoD calls a threat multiplier wrongly frames the climate issue in terms of security risks to Europe and the US, rationalizing border controls, fertility restrictions, and anti-terrorism measures as legitimate planks of northern climate policy. At the same time, the World Bank and International Organization for Migration have begun to support migration as a climate adaptation strategy, not least because migrant workers make good neoliberal subjects. In the United States and Europe, casting migrants as both a resource and a threat supports a simultaneously liberal and nativist border regime that keeps some migrants out and permits others as super exploitable victims. None of this is to say that climate change is not serious or that cutting carbon emissions is not important. It absolutely is important. The point of highlighting these critiques is to point out that simply affirming that climate change is real here and urgent is compatible with a range of political responses, the most institutionally dominant of which aim principally to reproduce status quo social relations, just adapted to rising temperatures in non-fossil energy regimes, maybe to return us to a certain kind of equilibrium. Nor is any of this to suggest that climate denial has entirely vanished. Cynical skeptics like Bjorn Lomborg still stalk the internet, employing very similar critiques of alarmism, determinism, and so on to weaken the case for emissions cuts. At the same time, the tendency towards climate determinism is strong enough that the scientist most closely associated with the counterfactual attribution method, Friederike Otto, has called on colleagues to, quote, stop blaming the climate for disasters. Ultimately, I want to suggest that the temptation to read for climate and nothing else follows from an overinvestment in truth as a condition of progressive climate policy, and by the same token, an overestimation of climate change's representation of challenges, sometimes described in terms of the crisis of imagination. So the crisis of imagination thesis has circulated in popular media since at least the late 1990s. We get a typical version from the climate activist Bill McKibben, who writes in a 2003 essay that because, quote, global warming has still to produce an Orwell or a Huxley, the absence of robust climate policy is a failure of imagination, and in this way, a literary failure. In a 2005 article for The Guardian titled The Burning Question, journalist Robert McFarlane asks why no serious climate literature has hit the shelves, suggesting that a popular culture raised on images of the bomb may never be able to represent the slow, dispersed, and non-spectacular catastrophes that define climate change. In climate art, representing climate change by gesturing at the limits of representation has become something of a stock move. For instance, in his Anthropocene photos, Edward Burtynsky uses a deep personalized aerial perspective to imbue industrial landscapes with a sense of geologic immensity, attesting to humans' Promethean force and the impossibility of fully representing our impact on the planet. Since at least 2008, literary scholars affiliated with the environmental humanities have written extensively about, quote, the representational obstacles and imaginative shortcomings in the literary engagement with climate change. And usually these obstacles have to do with incongruities between what Bakhtin and Christian called the chronotope of the literary novel on the one hand, and on the other hand, the spatial and temporal coordinates of climatic shifts rippling across planetary ecosystems over the course of deep or geologic time. This conflict between literary chronotopes and the spatiotemporal features described in climate change animates the term Anthropocene, whose drama lies in the collision of affixes denoting vastly different scales. We see the most influential version of this argument in Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Drawing on work by Ian Hackian and Franco Moretti, Ghosh argues that climate change is so hard to confront, imaginatively and politically, because global warming's distribution of bad weather conflicts with realist fiction's conventional ratios of setting an event. The tidy, predictable worlds of literary fiction, in Ghosh's view, no longer match the real world of our climatically altered present, amounting to a derangement that is also a political failure. And for Ghosh, the stakes of this derangement are high. Quote, If certain literary forms are unable to negotiate these waters, then they will have failed. And their failures will have to be counted as an aspect of the broader imaginative and cultural failure that lies at the heart of the climate crisis. Such a statement at once aggrandizes literature, treating literary engagement with climate change as a condition of our collective survival, and it takes a narrow view of what literature can do. The Princeton article I noted at Can the Humanities Help Solve Climate Change exemplifies a version of this narrow view. The article quotes Anne McClintock, who says, "To animate the science, we need creative stories, photographs, and films, poetry and music to make the planetary upheavals of climate change imaginable, tangible, and real. Only then can we envision viable strategies for action and social transformation." The implication is that when presented as scientific data, climate change is not imaginable, tangible, or real, making viable strategies for action similarly impossible to envision. Defined as a crisis of vision or imagination, the political impasse of climate change then becomes a test of humanity's value, encouraging a kind of heroic delusion. If we can prove we have something useful to say about climate change, maybe we can prove the humanity's worth once and for all. And to preview a larger argument, I want to suggest that this way of thinking responds, on the one hand, to the neoliberalization of higher education, especially after 2008, which has put added pressure on humanists to prove that they can help solve real world problems. On the other hand, it registers a sense of defeat, a sense, as Mike Davis put it in 2010, that, quote, "We have already lost the first epochal stage of the battle against global warming." So beyond the failure of the Kyoto Protocol, two losses were particularly damning at this time. The first was Congress's failure to pass cap and trade legislation ahead of the 2010 midterms, and partly as a result of this failure, the unwillingness of delegates at the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit to agree to binding reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In this moment of acute disappointment for the nascent climate movement, accounts of climate change as representational challenges, or our collective failure of imagination, offered an explanation for the unmet expectations of Obama's first term. This explanation redescribed a material conflict having to do with the power of capital as an epistemic dilemma, and explaining the trajectory of climate policy in terms of epistemic difficulties, routed through questions of literary representation, participated in a more general turn away from the material explanations of policy failure. It also confirmed the impression already central to a depoliticized strategy of the mainstream climate movement that more or better representations of climate change were needed to win climate action. So to return to the beginning, treating a political impasse as an imaginative failure, in a sense, demands the production of metonymic images and narratives, representations that can overcome the abstractions of data by figuring climate change through a single catastrophic event, dystopian landscape, or sympathetic victim. These representations satisfy a certain audience's desire to see the crisis they know to exist, but whose persistent invisibility can produce feelings of paralysis. Yet what these representations mean is not given in advance. As the dispute over the Syrian civil war clarifies, our expectations about what climate change looks like can overdetermine the meaning of a particular disaster. Indeed, our sense of what climate change looks like or will look like has become so clear, reinforced by disaster cinema and dystopian novels, as well as IPCC reports, journalism, NGO briefs, and activist statements, which consistently metonymize planetary transformations through local disasters, that the political and economic forces that determine what climate change is can fall out of the frame. And to lose sight of political economy is to lose sight of politics, which is to say that even as rising temperatures transform planetary ecosystems, political choices about how to organize human societies in relation to environmental constraints ultimately determine the shape of the future.
Ricardo, I say, I think it's really quite timely and brilliant intervention, right? I want to ask you about, you call it overriding, thesis, overriding vision. And the usage of the Syrian war as a key moment in your argument. Because in a certain sense, by utilizing that one example, it kind of on a certain way also borrows from the what we call the logics of the overriding. It kind of because I don't think many political events are framed in exactly that way, which is what makes that particular piece of evidence important, as well as in the best sense provided. I'm wondering whether political imagination that's demanded at this moment, when there's a planetary to use the term, is one that doesn't fully support the notion to return to politics as you usually for nations and collectives that understand themselves in political opposition to other collectives constitutes the conventions of political game. Would it be anti-political to try to call for a planetary with a political factors as the basic unit of political thinking, not a nation or a specific contestation, but collective on this planet. It's a grand scale of thinking, which you might say produces an impasse of another order. But when figures that stimulated the mythological imagination, the imagination, in what I consider a primal sense, figures like Gaia, and forces that do not necessarily obey an anthropogenic logic, solicited the imagination of great figures of imaginative thinking that required humanity itself to understand itself responsible for the construction of the planet, the world. Which is here's the force of my question, because I really like your mode of thinking. I'm wondering if the anti-political is if the remedy for the anti-political would be to return to the political as it is usually understood, might be in the name of saving that version of the political, perhaps evading what I understand to be, Casey, your primary provocation. How can the literary imagination respond to this question? And this is where I think the term greatness, when a figure such as Vigo begin to think that the imagination of the humanity itself is what is responsible for the creation of the world. When a planetary event that can destroy the world can call forth an imagination that responds by calling for a different relation to not a country, an institution, but the planet we share. So to put it simply, I'm wondering whether we need to think politically differently at this moment. And in the face of what might be called Gaia's instruction to humanity.
A different iteration.
Okay.
And then Lon's question, how do you see the relationship between the political and aesthetic education? And your critique of how perhaps the aesthetic shouldn't be doing more. But in your case, I would just a different iteration.
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions. So maybe to start where you started, the reason I'm interested in what I'm calling metonymic disasters, although I didn't really elaborate on, is because it seems to me this interest in thinking about the planetary scale or describing climate change as a planetary phenomenon and also temporally dispersed, et cetera, demands that we use particulars to stand in for this general phenomenon. So that's an aesthetic question, that's also a political question. Which particular place, event, person who's being affected do we use to represent this general planetary phenomenon? And so part of my argument, and it's not just Syria, is that the choices about which places stand in for the universal or the planetary are already politicized. And two other examples. One is Bangladesh, which is invariably invoked as the most climate vulnerable place on Earth. And a lot of images you see of semi-inundated landscapes in Bangladesh are actually representations of transformations that have to do with shrimp aquaculture. So it is vulnerable to climate change, but there are also big landowners coming in, buying up people's rice fields and turning them into shrimp farms. So there needs to, so when I am calling for a return to a kind of political thinking, really it's a return to kind of political economic thinking, which is to say there are these other processes that remain relevant for changing landscapes and people's relationships to environments that need somehow to be accounted for in the climate story. So I wouldn't want to give up the idea of.
But you need to think of political. I mean, you could have a scale that distributes different. That you can maintain political economy to think as everyone is. Think of the concluding paragraphs of Chakrabarty's climate thesis, in which he's talking about the kind of negative collective, in which everyone is responding to a negative universe, and without disallowing the sense that there would be a different way to distribute. Depending upon sectors of the planet that would require different allocations of understanding, resources, etc. I just don't. What I'm having trouble with is what I take to be the most important aspect of your intervention, but also the most, in a certain sense, conservative aspect of the intervention, because it seems to wish to return to politics as it is usually understood, without answering the challenge that you've also posed. If the response to the challenge you posed is to return to the inverse of what you call anti-politics, which that restores a political imagination, but it does so in a way that serves what was already understood to be the revolutionary or progressive aspects of that political imagination.
To be fair to the questioners, let's put the questions on the table. Sure, sure. We start, Stathis, with your question, and then questions.
I mean, I'm just thinking. I was also, first of all, very great. The second, I was struck by the anti-politics argument I was thinking through. But John's, the exchange you've been having is kind of dramatizing for me. So I'm just adding to that by saying something very directly. Anti-capitalist politics is planetary politics. There's no way that there can be anti-capitalist politics that isn't planetary, because capitalism is planetary. So, so I don't think that we need to get bogged down on this thing about. I think we even if there is a crisis of imagination, the crisis is elsewhere. It's not because we cannot envision the planet. We can be engaged in a planetary politics, like anti-capitalist politics, by simultaneously engaging in specific politics, according to where we are situated and so on. I don't think that the two things are separate, certainly not incompatible, so that then we need to think of another kind of politics, or we might think of a demise of politics. That's why I'm very suspicious of this argument that climate change politics is interfering with our so-called traditional leftist politics. Because it is in many ways what we now call climate change politics, we have been engaged with for a very long time. And unfortunately, we have not been seeing it as a planetary politics until we are in this sort of ecological catastrophic situation. But that is certainly in the powers of the United States. So I would just tilt it slightly, or whatever would be the term, to account for that. I think that's the kind of thing I'm getting in this conversation.
Christian?
It's a huge and interesting. So in this room, with us here together, let me start by saying, I agree with almost everything you said. So we lost on anybody in the room that, at least in our conceptual framings, it's like there's a antithetical, like say polemical thrust to the choices. So finding that I'm agreeing with you, like point for point, sentence gets interesting. So I've been trying to think a little bit about where we don't line up, and maybe just as a down payment on the whole conversation. Try to think about what would need to be adjudicated. So I found very stimulating, convincing the whole early account in your talk about let's say the reifications of climate change discourse, right? Kind of really building up character. That is positing climate change as a reified pseudo cause, or even as a kind of in the era of non-human agency. So that makes a lot of sense to me as a certain kind of asking us to reflect on some of the limits of climate change discourse. It's then in when you shift gears over to the question of the imagination, that they tend to be the media in different film and novels getting over to go. I guess this may not be a conversation right this second, but I guess what I would wonder is whether you think the narrative media, just to get things started, say fiction, prose fiction, and feature film, repeat the reifications of climate change as to the cause, because I think they would have to be separately demonstrated that they do that. You mentioned Don't Look Up, and Don't Look Up is a really interesting example, not least of which it's not about climate change, right? There's a meteor that's going to hit the Earth, right? And that seems like a very clear instance of something that, in order to talk about climate change, has had to swap in an entirely different kind of event in order to introduce, let's say, reifying cognizability Right, so the meteor is event-like in a way that climate change is not. But so that would suggest a representational problem as much as it suggests a representation fix.
Can we-
Let me just.
Okay, yeah, just one thing.
Yeah, very quick, it's very quick question, so hang on a minute. So I'm also very interested in your, I think wholly justified attack on let's say the metonymic storm, the metonymic catastrophe. And I'm not sure how to evaluate this. I would tend to say that are recognizing that these metonymic events, the particular event, cannot stand in for the heating of the planet as a trend, as something secular. I would tend to think of that precisely as a problem for representation. Right, and to that extent, as further evidence, I don't like the language of the crisis of imagination, but let's just use it. Further evidence of the crisis of imagination. And that is to say that the important dimensions of the thing have not yet yielded to representation. And I think your tendency is to say, look, we've rendered it entirely too representative. Right, it's become representative in a facile way, and I'm not sure on which grounds we decided that one of those descriptions.
Questions or sorry, that's a question.
If you're over its questions, I guess just scaling back a little bit, I really kind of resonated with your analysis, and I'm kind of interested in two more general questions. I'd be curious to see you kind of explore more, which is following your analysis here, kind of where I'd like to see maybe clarification on where the contestation takes place, a productive kind of contestation. Is it over the kind of chain of ideological associations then that this concept has? Is it more about the debates taking place and the framing discursively of those debates? Or are you kind of charging this, the kind of, so what then, right? What is the alternative to this discourse? Because I think the model that you're applying there can maybe be applied to other areas of cultural politics under neoliberalism, right? It's kind of framework being applied there as well. And then the second question, kind of following up on that, is why for you is climate change an important concept for applying this methodology, and saying here, actually, let's look instead at political economy, right? And how exactly do you do that versus other sectors in cultural politics as well? Is it something about this planetary understanding? Is it about definitions of being human and how we relate to one another on a planetary level? So I'd like to hear.
Briefly, or no.
Charles can start tomorrow.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking all these questions. So maybe starting with Victoria's questions, which I think are related to Christians. I think that there is, of course, a way to think about climate change in concert with other kinds of changes that are happening and have been happening for a long time. There's no reason necessarily that the climate story has to override other accounts of how people transform the environments and societies in which they live. So what I'm initially responding to, what I have been responding to for a couple of years, I guess, is really the criticism, the way literary critics approach this question, where the presumption seems to be in a lot of it, even from people who I really respect and whose analyses are quite nuanced, that there is an absence of concrete representations of the problem, and that this absence of concrete representations helps us to explain why there has not been an adequate policy response. And that's an oversimplification, but in some ways that is a motivating claim for a lot of this critical research. And so my question is, what kinds of representations would satisfy these critics' call for a form of representation or imagination that would, warrant political intervention of the sort that they think is necessary. And it seems to me, and maybe I didn't flesh this out as well as I could have, that metonymic disasters become one kind of representation that seems to satisfy the criteria that these critics have implicitly or explicitly set up. But maybe it's not the only one. So maybe a limitation of this analysis is that it's not doing an exhaustive survey of all the different strategies that authors and filmmakers could use to stage it, including through allegory, as Christian points out in Don't Look Up. And I take your point. So the recourse to allegory or metonymic disaster is actually further evidence of the crisis of imagination. And I think I agree actually with that. In that sense, the question is about how we represent as opposed to whether we represent or why, then yes, there is still a crisis. But the way that this sort of invocation of a crisis of imagination lines up with a certain kind of climate movement activist discourse that seems to explain the absence of action with reference to the kind of erosion of some sort of shared truth or the inability to actually see the stakes or delusion or derangement. That's what I'm pushing. And then this question of a planetary politics, I mean, I take the point that what I'm calling for is sort of conservative, potentially in the sense that it's asking us to step backwards. But two things. One, like I said, I think that telling stories about climate change it can be compatible with telling stories about other kinds of social forces, and that this is something that we should do. But also, I'm still convinced that some kind of particular, in the Marxist tradition, we think of class has to stand in for the whole, because there is no way to consolidate 8 billion people into some kind of unified force. So we have to choose which class we see as a universal class. And that's Marxism has an answer for that, but other traditions have different answers for that. And that has to be negotiated. And part of what I'm interested in these metonymic disasters is seeing how that question is negotiated in different kinds of media.
Yeah. Are there more questions? Thank you. Can we take 10 minutes before Charles? Will that be okay? I was thinking what Harold Bloom would say. He would say, not metonymic, he would say Tesla. Right?
This is, I just finished a very large scale book, which is called The Kinds of Poetry I Want. Screams, screeds, scraps, scrapes. And this is one section. What I was originally going to do from the Williams, Eliot, it doesn't have time because this kept getting bigger. But this is from a section called Summa Contra Gentiles, an oration in 17 cantos. And it has the first epigraph after Aquinas. I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the poetic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. To use the words of hilarity, I am aware that I owe this to art as the chief duty of my work, that my every word and sense may speak of it. After Aquinas. The second is from the Iliad, my translation. Into my heart, torn, turning it over. And the final from Philip Marlowe, Raymond Chandler, trouble is my business. And so this is the first, I'm going to read the first canto. And the first canto is called Alta Cockers. Cranky poems for aging with anger, resentment, intemperance, and regret. So this is sort of my, I'm trying to make a career for myself once I retire. This is the ad for it. Poems to help you age without losing your negative capabilities. This anthology collects centuries of poems of bad advice and denial, guaranteed to pour salt on wounds large and small, from poets who developed exquisite expertise in nursing old wounds in old age and exacerbating infirmities, real and imagined. Sections include, I don't want a revolution if I have to dance. Despair springs eternal. I did it before you were born. And incontinent songs. The name withheld for this blurb, I had this blurb for the book, but it was withheld at the request of the family. A comfortless collection bound to agitate and annoy while discouraging the elderly from aging gracefully. Coming soon from You Bet Your Life Press's Dorothy Parker collection. So that's the first canto. The second, a little bit longer, take the rest of my time. It's the fourth one, and it's called Come Back to the Raft, Lionel Baby. The Jewish Imagination, 1950. Letter to Paul Beauvais. I've added some epigraphs for this, including from that earlier Eliot Williams one from Spring and All. The only realism in art is of the imagination. It is only thus that the work escapes plagiarism after nature and becomes a creation. This actually just now. Invention of new forms to embody this reality of art. The one thing which art is must occupy all serious minds concerned. So Spring and All is 100 years old, like the wasteland. And this is my translation from Proust, Time Refound, 1927. Therefore, the best among the young, the most intelligent, the most interesting, like only works which have a high moral and sociological, even religious bearing. And now more specific to this piece from Philip Whalen's Journal, 1963, great kind of beat new American poet. Yesterday, sad to read of Dr. Williams dying in Rutherford. We lose a member of the family. No more Bill, and what a world is left to us. Henry Rago, Delmore Schwartz, the Trillings, Jack Barza, the booby professors will reign from now on. Bah. 1963. And this from Huckleberry Finn. If I had a yaller dog that didn't know no more than a person's conscience does, I would piss him. It takes up more room than all the rest of the person's insides, and yet ain't no good, no how. July 14th, 2021. Dear Paul, there is much to admire in Lionel Trilling's The Liberal Imagination. I can see your insistence on imaginative intelligence, and Love's Shadow connects to that. Trilling advocates, quote, variousness and possibility, which implies the awareness of complexity and difficulty, unquote, along with a certain degree of unresolvability. He argues for historicism against the new critics. I am sure all for that. Yet I feel there is a bait and switch too, that he himself would and did exclude difficult poetry and would and did struggle with unsanctioned variety. Louis Menand, in his new introduction to the New York Review edition, does nothing to confront these problems, and indeed seems to want to make Trilling as safe a present-day New Yorker as he is, and Trilling was for the New Yorker and Times in his day. Menand tries to undo his guru in putting hygienics over aesthetics. Trilling's quote from Menand, first lesson and most influential, is that there are more and less politically hygienic works of literature, and the function of criticism is to identify them and explain why they tend to be good or bad politically and have consequences. A job that requires specific skill, since a book's politics may be quite different from its political consequences, unquote. Trilling's pathos has become Menand's bathos, but not in the Douglas Sirk sense. Can Trilling be saved from Menand or Adam Kirsch or Leon Wurst-Latier, or is that the fate he earned? Trilling's liberalism has an unacknowledged demonic twin, the hygienics of neo-illiberalism. It's not as bad as some of the other commentary folk or Hilton Kramer, but it's a slippery slope. It's a Cold War liberal humanism, of course, and as you and others have shown, that too is a God that failed. But then I come into this humming along with Phil Oakes's Love Me, I'm a Liberal, and Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven. Perhaps the most striking, if unsurprising and common thing about the liberal imagination, read in retrospect, is the repression of the war and the invisibility of this well-known and at other times explicitly embraced Jewishness. The war going on while Trilling wrote the essays, and just a few years over when he published the book. No substantial mention of the extermination of the European Jews, hardly a mention of the word Jew or Nazi or Hiroshima in the entire book. This repression is the subject of Al Filre's superb book, 1960, When Art and Literature Confronted the Memory of World War II and Remade the Modern. I understand why Trilling chose not to foreground his Jewishness, just struck by it now. Jewish invisibility was not only a mode of survival, but also a tactic of secularization that he believed in and which I inherited. In 1940, Trilling became the first Jewish scholar given tenure at Columbia's English department, despite anti-Semitic headwinds. His relation to his Jewishness is complex, and there are times he addresses it and times he chooses not to. And this is a footnote which I'm going to include in this. For a recent discussion of Trilling's Jewish identification, see teachers and students on Lionel Trilling's blurbs in Joshua Lambert's The Literary Mafia, Jews Publishing in Post-War American Literature, that's from Yale University Press, 2022. Lambert chronicles Trilling's valuable professional support of his male Jewish students, especially ones writing about Jewishness. One case study gives a detailed account of his effective promotion of Irving Feldman. The life Trilling wanted for himself as a university professor of English was still largely denied to Jews. In the years of his early manhood, university teachers of literature were making a determined effort to maintain the purity of what they thought of as Anglo-Saxon culture. This was especially true at Columbia, which always felt itself to be in danger of, this is a further quote, which always found itself to be in danger of turning into a Jewish enclave like City College. The gentlemen scholars of Columbia's Department of English were disposed to being all the more defensive on account of their university location in New York City, where Anglo-Saxon culture anxiously fended off what is felt to be the barbarians of the immigrant horde. So that's from an article about Trilling's Jewishness by a scholar of Trilling. Following Trilling, if not to say Eric Auerbach, Jewish professors of English generally did not teach courses in Jewish studies and often averted foregrounding Jewish subject matter. a path not readily available to later professors hired to teach their own primary racial, gender, or ethnic identity. This was certainly the course I took coming to SUNY Buffalo in 1989, even if the number of Jewish writers I included on my syllabi was as undeniable as it was unmarked. Yet Trilling's approach, as much as my own, was always precarious, since anti-Semitism thrives on the demonization of both the Jewish appropriation of and complicity with the national cultures we found ourselves part of, both founding and founding. Free-thinking Jews, what Isaac Deutscher, 1907 to 1967, so similar dates, called in 1958 non-Jewish Jews, might disassociate ourselves from Jewish immersion without a pledge of absorption into a deracinated, sanitized Western civilizing. Such disavowal might allow for affiliation of diasporic with dispossessed, congregating on an imaginary raft somewhere between here and there. Call it poetry. In the liberal imagination, Trilling does address slavery in the Civil War when he writes on Mark Twain, and I can't help but feel the projection. Seen in this way, it's painful. It marks Trilling's self-fashioning as an Arnoldian figure of high culture, where Jews might be heard, if not seen as such. Trilling's 1938 doctoral dissertation was on Arnold, and I contrast that with Louis Zukofsky, same dates, 1904 to 1974, roughly, classmate of Trilling at Columbia, who wrote his MA thesis on Henry Adams. So the two choices that these guys made. I find great poignancy in Trilling's warning in his essay in praise of the Partisan Review about the, quote, alienation of educated classes from the most impressive literature of our time, when you realize this applies to Trilling, and that his valuation of moral, quote, seriousness and, quote, high respectability puts him in conflict with aesthetic invention. There is something Freudian about this, killing the mother of invention out of love for the father of quality control. In the ideological service of Cold War liberalism. Trilling's lust for high culture trips on his stigmatizing the primitiveness of the uncultivated, as if to almost name the shtetl. His confident praise of, quote, the advance of civilization, unquote, associated with high culture came just a few years after the death camps that turned his assumptions topsy-turvy. And yet, in his essay on Huckleberry Finn, Trilling sees Huck's way out of both primitive and upright bondage through the guidance of, quote, true father, the Black Saint Jim. And he compares Jim to Stephen Dedalus's Jewish spiritual father, Leopold Bloom. In this illusion of Jewish exile, Jim and Huck's queer bond suggests an American exodus, echoing the slave songs. Put that in your Freudian pipe and smoke it. Leslie Fiedler, 1917 to 2003, so younger, was a lively and friendly presence at SUNY Buffalo and arrived there in 1989. He was one of an unusually large number of Jewish intellectuals associated with the English department. Our offices were located in Samuel Clemens Hall. Fiedler's Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey, which explored the queer bond between Jim and Huck, was written in 1948, the same year as Trilling's essay was published in Trilling's home turf, the Partisan Review, Jews on Huck. Fiedler's essay has a delightful impudence that gives it more currency than Trilling's, but they both singled out this book just a few years after the war. But that they both singled out this book just after the war is striking. Jonathan Iraq has a chapter on Trilling's essay on Huckleberry Finn, and it's Huckleberry Finn as idol and target. He, unlike anybody else, places the work in the context of both, unlike Trilling anyway, places the work in the context of both anti-fascism and anti-communism, and notes the connection of the Nazi death camp to American slavery. Trilling quotes without comment Twain's use of the racial epithet that Iraq in his book insists cannot be neutralized in 20th century accounts simply by citing the historical context of Huckleberry Finn's anti-racism. Related to this is Trilling's almost hilarious account of the Kinsey report, which even so is admirable for its time. In effect, Trilling's retort to Kinsey, Freudian slip in there too, interesting, is just because people do something. So in effect, Trilling's retort to Kinsey, the famous Kinsey report, is that just because people do something doesn't make it right. Quote, the report has in mind both a physical normality and a moral normality, the acceptability on the authority of animal behavior of certain usually taboo practices, unquote, Trilling. In a Freudian way to which Freudian Trilling seems oblivious, his fear that queerness would be given the status of normal ends up undermining his view of what he calls, quote, important books, unquote. His discomfort reveals his own acknowledged anxiety about, quote, moral normality, and by extension, who gets to be normal or neurotic. I realize it is outrageous and unacceptable, truly, even for me. But in the following passage, I'm substituting Jew for homosexual from the Kinsey report. So this is my adaptation. The report holds out the hope to respectable Christians that they might be as intellectual as Jews if they were as unrestrained as this group. But before respectable Christians aspire to this unwanted freedom, they had better ascertain in how far Jews are ridden by anxiety and in how far their intellectuality is to be correlated with other ways of dealing with anxiety, such as dope, and in how far it is actually enjoyable. The report has in mind to raise questions about negative attitude toward Jews, but then it goes on to imply that there could only be one standard for the judgment of human conduct. That is, the conduct as it exists, which is to say that conduct is not to be judged at all, except presumably insofar as it causes pain to others. But from its attitude to the inconvenience to the Gentiles, we must presume that not all pain is to be reckoned with. The preponderant weight of its argument is that conduct is a behavioral fact to be considered only in its behavioral aspect, and apart from any idea or ideal, might make it a social fact as having no ascertainable personal or cultural meaning and no possible consequences, as being not available to social interpretation at all. In short, the report, by its primitive conception of the nature of fact, quite negates the importance and even the existence of the Jew as distinguishable in terms of content in terms of conduct from the Gentile. That is why, although it is possible to say the report that it brings to light, it is necessary to say that it spreads confusion. So that's my really very unfair substitution. Trilling again, no one who reads thoughtfully the dialectic of Huck's great moral crisis will ever again be wholly able to accept without question and some irony the assumptions of the respectable morality by which he lives. Evidently not. Trilling often feels to me like a mid-20th century version of Huck's Widow Douglas, trying to civilize us. Or maybe he's like Tom Sawyer, getting hung up on doing things regular, like in the books that make up Tom's canon, complicating and possibly thwarting a path to freedom already won. Quote, it don't make no difference from Huckleberry Finn. It don't make no difference how foolish it is. It's the right way, and it's the regular way. And there ain't no other way that I ever heard of. And I read all the books that gives any information about these things. The question of how the liberal imagination can acknowledge Jews, blacks, as well as those whose sexual or mental orientation goes against, quote, reflecting society, much less aesthetic wildness, haunts Trilling's book in the guise of what Menon calls hygienics. In the end, Kinsey is an Einsteinian and Freudian leap ahead of Trilling, which he somewhat ambivalently suggests. Jump cut to Diana Trilling's abjection before the very Jewish Norman Mailer and his misogynist prisoner of sex in 1971 town hall debacle, or Trilling's son James outing him as cognitively perverse, ADD, in 1999 in the American Scholar. Trilling writes of, quote, the inadequacy, unquote, of passive American versus active European prose literature as of 1950 in ways that track him in this inadequacy. Freudian sense intended. He admitted he admirably advocates the work of the more radical European novelists over more tepid Americans, criticizing the Americans for, quote, conforming to liberal democratic tradition and market values. It must necessarily occur to us to ask, he writes, why is it that these particular ideas have not infused with force and cogency the literature that embodies them? Ironically, this statement comes back to bite Trilling and the criticism his ideas embody. But let me just say it. I more than agree with, I follow Trilling on the need now, as much as in 1950, to push back against market and liberal humanist values in making aesthetic judgment. Paul, it's now 21 months since I started this letter to you on Bastille Day in the middle of a pandemic, and I am still confused about my sense not only of Trilling's inadequacy, but my ability to identify it. Why does Trilling's contemporary and partisan review comrade Clement Greenberg, 1909 to 1994, remain so much more compelling in his account of aesthetic judgment, as well as his actual judgments, even if his teleology led him to disintegrate into art history's unpredictable metamorphoses? Trilling suffers from his examples, which seem like admirable but stock figures out of the mainstream liberal culture he fostered. His negative examples, Eugene O'Neill and John Dos Passos, with their buoyant and at times wacky energy, betray him. I'll play. Speaking of Pathos, at one point, Trilling speaks in a negative way of the, quote, piety of liberal democratic art, which he otherwise calls Philistine. But in another context, he says, a resonance of piety is essential for art that counts. Trilling is torn between these two senses of piety, as rote morality and as imagination. This conflict forms the emotional center of the liberal imagination and drives his anti-aestheticism. At college, he recounts, when he was at college, he recounts, we were very down on Walter Pater, very hostile to what we call aestheticism. We took him to be everything that was disembodied and precious. He reports a change of heart on Pater, but his youthful resistance hardens into what I'd call Cold War aesthetic containment. Menand reminds us that Trilling requires that we consider the political, and I'd add aesthetic consequences of ideas recognized as different than politics. The consequences of Trilling's ideas did not hold up well in the Cold War, where the American usurpation of imagination and freedom, call it the imperial lyric, became a tool of global and local containment under the guise of humanist anti-communist morality. I may be projecting my thought, almost the same years as 1901 to 1977, onto Lionel Mordecai Trilling, 1904 to 1975, then Fanny Cohen, that's his mother, Fanny Cohen. I was born the year the liberal imagination was published. My parents had similar parental immigrant histories to Trilling, though they had little in common, but then that little may be a lot. The liberal imagination, I was published, as I said, the year I was born. I met James Trilling, the son, once in college. He was 2 years ahead of me. When Harvard President Nathan Pusey was invited to Adams House in 1969 or 70, a group of us arranged to do a series of confrontive anti-war toasts. Mine started, in the name of Henry David Thoreau, wrote, but I can't recall what quote I used. We welcome you to Adams House. A young man who I had never seen, dressed in full J. Press preppery, turned to me and expressed his contempt both for our demonstration and for me personally. That was James Trilling. Nowadays, I very much like J. Crew, shirts and underwear and all things seersucker. It comes down to this, which I say knowing is ungenerous and even unfair and ethical. Poetry as a disruptive force hardly graces the page of the liberal imagination. Poetry and aesthetics are resisted and then repressed. What does Mandelstam say? Poetry has not rumpled the sheets, has never spent the night. That's in Mandelstam's conversation with Dante, interestingly, that quote. And thinking Mandelstam, another contemporary, this is an interesting person to think about in this light of what I'm talking about, Jewish imagination. In this, Trilling is in line with Winters and Blackmore's distrust of Poe that I discussed via Samuel Delany in the patequirical essay in Picture Poetry. Consider this touching private comment in a letter from 1950, the same year as Lit Imagination, to 24-year-old gay Jewish Allen Ginsberg. This is his letter to Ginsberg. I won't try to respond to your interesting struggles with the theory of verse. I've been reading Williams lately and have a growing sense of what he is up to. I think I like what he is up to, although sometimes I am wearied and depressed by what he writes, as I was wearied and depressed when I met him last spring, although at the same time I was rather taken by it. Did I ever confess to you that my relation to modern verse is very largely academic and dutiful? It seldom means as much to me as prose. That's the end of Trilling's letter. Trilling's personal support for Ginsberg is worth contrasting to his ardent professional sponsorship of Irving Feldman, a poet as distant from Williams and Ginsberg as a model railway tinker is from an astronaut. With Trilling's support, Feldman came into the scene with an attack on Carl Shapiro's Jewish ethnic identification in a review of Shapiro's Poems of a Jew, published in Commentary in November 1958. Feldman wants to police Jewish identity, a quote from Feldman. But what has happened is that, except in name only, Shapiro is no longer a Jew. Jewishness has become as mythical to this neo-Semite as it is to anti-Semites, quote unquote, Irving Feldman. Irving Feldman was my unfriendly colleague at SUNY Buffalo's Samuel Clemens Hall. While avoiding teaching literature classes in the graduate and undergraduate program, Feldman loudly proclaimed his contempt for new approaches to literary study, and especially for the poetics program. A poet of great authenticity, you can see. I figured, that's by the way, I laugh at poet of great authenticity. I figured that it was views like those which got Feldman a MacArthur Fellowship in 1992, as opposed to my poetics program comrades, Freely, Howe, Tedlock, or Fetterman. But then it may just be that the MacArthur prefers highbrow kitsch to what we were doing. When they say genius grants, I wonder, genius for what? See, that one says, it's a good one, I like that one. In an article in the Buffalo News, just after Creeley and I left, so this would have been 2001, something like that, 2003 actually, Buffalo News. After taking a quick swipe at Creeley as to visit, Irving Feldman gets to me. You have to imagine this in the voice of the police chief played by Rod Steiger in the heat of the night. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I won't do that voice, but you gotta think of it. So this is my colleague, Irving Feldman, in the Buffalo News. Bernstein, I could observe in action, building his empire from the word go. I knew even before he came, he was powerful. I always wonder about people like that. What kind of interior emptiness they're trying to fill with power. His poetry shows a certain kind of interior emptiness, I think. Feldman could be replaying his put down of Shapiro almost a half a century earlier. Quote, these poems seem to lack an inner Jewish consciousness. Viewed as art, they lack lyric centrality. That's going back to the earlier Feldman piece. I appreciate the Jewish culture I'm a part of values quarrelsomeness over solidarity. It might be the Jews in the world of secular culture may at times find it safer, if not more convenient or even familiar, to criticize one another, triggered and triggering. But this is a minor chord compared to this major one. Jewish poets, artists, critics, philosophers, friends, past and present, have helped form my thinking and been supportive beyond measure. Feldman, Fetterman, and I once read together at an academic conference in Buffalo. We should have taken the act on the road, billed as Three Faces of Judaism. But let me now shift gears to take up the discussion you and Bruce have recently been having about whether the 1960s reaction against sanctified literary tradition, great books, so Bruce is still talking about that to some degree, produced something sinister. I wouldn't define the problematic reaction as spontaneity, process, openness, or informality, a version of professionalism, as I don't see much of those. On the left, I think the Weathermen and their nemesis, the Progressive Labor Party, played into the hands of the right just as much as the social virtue gospel true believers do now. The power dynamics you discuss in your Debray piece are closer to it, the erasure of history and ideology. And there is a line from core curriculum humanism, liberalism to that. Indeed, much of the virtue of the left is not left at all, but good news liberalism. Otherwise, the danger is going down the rabbit hole of Frederick Jameson and his attack on postmodern fragmentation, including, you recall, a poem of Bob Perlman. Trilling in his 1968 article in the Partisan Review on the modern element in literature, discusses the ambivalent embrace of teaching a course in modern, i.e. early 20th century literature. And then too, Trilling remains associated with the Columbia core curriculum. The problem with teaching only official canonical figures from long ago has been subject to much debate, and it's hard to go back there. But perversely, I want to argue that this reactionary view actually undergirds the current swerve away from teaching literary works. The view that poems have no intrinsic value and that aesthetic value is spurious. The short version, high canonical, civilizing, high C, pitch for literature degrades the significance, albeit intentionally, because its understanding of literature takes pride in being narrow, ahistorical, and ethnocentric. Literature reflects refinement, not an active aesthetic intelligence. It's the ghost in the current no literature machine because it seems to make literature such a plumb target. And those of us who make the strongest aesthetic argument against the high C pitch are as much on the outs now as before. In short, high C great books relies on a fundamental ontological and epistemological misreading of what poetry and what literature is, how it performs, you might say. So its effective devaluation of most poetry, including most poetry's significance, continues in the present, turning the approval brands into living dead, devouring the whole field of action. Perhaps it was Harold Bloom that made the high C canonical argument best fit for parody. It's the 1-2 punch. First, you miscast literature as rigged supremacist joint, and that in turn opens to an attack as rigged supremacist joint. So we just don't need it. In my talk at the MLA, I point to Bloom's proclamation of the near impossibility of a major American poet to be Jewish. Bloom's argument has a kinship with Eliot's in After Strange Gods, the concept that poetry must be read within a defined tradition. For Eliot, Protestant, and I won't read the Eliot quote, but you can imagine it. I can't escape that these secular Jews wanted to elevate certain works to sacred status to the exclusion of contemporary others, which means that his class of priests, rabbis got the last word in their commentaries. If you fix the sacred text masterwork, no matter how great they are, you don't allow for conflict with contemporary other works. Canonical art is only to have contemporary social meaning when challenged by other contemporary art fashions, to echo Baudelaire on virtue. Dickinson and Emerson knew this, and Peirce and many others, including you, as in your Debray piece and elsewhere. Clement Greenberg knew this too, but he also got pulled back into the muck of a monolithic view of art history and what counts, as much as I still do love aspects of Greenberg. Coming to the end, as I trust this letter makes clear, Jewish solidarity is not part of my experience or practice. This lack of solidarity is one of the most vibrant aspects of Jewish ethnic culture. As you may remember, Jonathan Iraq, then English department chairman, invited me to teach at Columbia in 2002, spring semester when Kenneth Cope was sick. and I was able to take his undergraduate class with the idea that perhaps I might join the English department. Columbia, after all, was just a short walk from my apartment where I had lived all my life, and a lot closer than Buffalo, New York. I met with Kenneth at his place on Claremont, the only time we'd ever had a chance to chat. He had been using a Norton anthology for the class. I explained I would create my own set of readings of innovative post-war American poetry. I also included his recent collection, New Addresses. And since I now found myself in philosophy hall, I went to see Sylvain Lautrenjé in the French department floor. Sylvain, who like Coke was Jewish, though from Europe, appeared to have no connection to the folks in the English department, despite his close proximity. He told me he was eager to free himself from Columbia. Another Jewish faculty member at Columbia, Edward Mendelson, the Lionel Trilling professor, was no less as unfriendly to me as Feldman had been in Buffalo. And that seemed likely to settle the matter whether I would go to Columbia. At a faculty lecture I attended, Mendelson declared that there was no longer any interest in surrealism, justly so. This despite the fact that a surrealist show across the park at the Met was attracting huge crowds. Mendelssohn's colleagues kept quiet, the way Orthodox families keep kosher, but I couldn't. So keep in mind when I say, if teaching modern literature means Mendelssohn's Auden-centric provincialism, is that any better than no literature? Is it worse? Because it makes literary study, it makes aesthetics into what in Huckleberry Finn is called comb up Sundays. An easy target for marginalization is parochial and haughty. Now, for sure, Orden's better than that and will survive. But can the English department? This is also why I say that the New Yorker books and the New Yorker are not just missing the boat, they are sinking it. But poetry will survive. A graduate student at Penn told me how much he loved Mendelssohn's seminar, how much she loved Mendelssohn's seminar, pointing to the fact that he did not allow students to eat in his seminar. He had refinement. I keep thinking of Dorothy Fields' 1904 to 1974 song. He never came down to dinner without his shirt was on. He had refinement. My Midrashic antinomianism in the Paterquirk's essay is meant to be funny, but it speaks to the point. That is, as in social gospel, masterpieces morph into virtue, and then you don't need literary works at all. This liberal, illiberal era leads to the elimination of literature, as Terry Eagleton leads the charge in his literary theory. Yes, new works are uncooked, unrefined, unmastered. That is just why they have the potential challenge, even if you do. Over the years, nightmarish trillings have repeatedly come after me. These phantoms take shape on my superego or my id. I get the two confused. Only it's not only imaginary. We have a high preponderance of Columbia English department.
Then you should compliment it all.
But the people who are here from Columbia, I like them.
It is amazing that man emphasizes the hygienic. I have never read that introduction.
I went back several times to say, could he really have read that word, use that word?
In the 30s, condemned those novelists who thought that the task of the novel was to be the commissioner of moral sanitation.
But whatever Manan means by hygienics, he's not, he's referring to it as an evaluative technique. You consider not just the political value of the work, but the consequences of the work, which relates to the climate change talks too. So I mean, that's the issue that relates again to what a lot of folks here are talking about. But then he uses hygienics about that. You could say maybe better nowadays hydraulics of flood damage that it's doing.
Don't get too hot. But isn't that in the context of McKinsey?
No, he doesn't mention McKinsey at all. That's another.
But Trilling, when he's talking about the McKinsey report, which he sees himself as a threat.
Yes.
To literature and to the novel in particular, he, as a kind of counter factual, generates doesn't he generate a representation of literature as having as its primary duty hygienic response.
Yeah, he doesn't use the word hygienic, but yes, of course, I mean, that's why I. But I'm, one of the things that and this, I revised this yet further after Jonathan wrote me, and I read his Mark Twain stuff, and I saw that Twain as being, civilizing was sort of perfect for grade in a way, that the Twain's, mocking of the idea of civilizing, spelled with an S, by the way. Yes, I mean, that's the whole issue, and he goes both ways. That's why, he kept going back and revising this over the years. With he, I say this is the pathos or the bathos of the work. He will use terms like that in positive and negative ways. So he will say self-important is bad, and then pages later, he says the importance of Western. So he goes both ways, and which is interesting. So but this is my problem.
The term self-importance, he was.
Not well importance. He doesn't say moral significance, virtue. Sometimes he's positive about it, but when he's talking about the bankruptcy, I mean, in the work, for those of you, I had never really read Trilling. I had disliked him for decades before I ever read him, so I was prejudiced when I came to it. But his view is that the American writing on the Europeans is not active; it's passive. Which also. By the way, I don't want to get too Freudian, but once you get in wanting to think about it, it's itself a kind of a problematic sexual view. And it's hard to avoid that when he has the Kinsey thing. So active, if it's Europeans, it's good. Passive, but by passive, of course, he's attacking all left literature, and others as well, but in particular literature that's aligned with the left. And I mean, that's the polemic. So there's where the social message, cannot make it aesthetic. Well, of course, I agree with that, up until the point where I radically disagree with it. So.
Isn't important, but for what it's worth, the students who were they occupied Columbia when you and I were not there. Was it 69?
The occupation of Columbia was the spring of 68, when I was a senior in high school.
Poster. Wanted poster. Lionel Trains Joe. Wanted that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, see, I come out of that culture, so I imbibe that view, which is, but I try to. I mean, I hope I hope I thicken the issue, and it is common because there is a fundamental ambivalence in what he's arguing for, and that's why, of course, Jonathan would say, as he wrote to me in a letter, that he still finds very compelling aspects of the argument in liberal imagination.
But Charles, wouldn't you say that, I mean, in every situation of assimilation, and I think it applies in terms of power, and this assimilation, there is ambivalence.
Well, of course.
Disavow that. I mean, the struggle for assimilation requires that you have taming in a kind of changing yourself, and so that you can, in fact, feel, after tenure, the stuff we're talking about last night, you become.
Yes, I mean, it's a complicated overlay. Normally, I would, as I was saying to a couple of you, I mean, I've never written about this within this frame. In fact, most of my, 73 years old, I've quit most of my life ever taking up this issue framed this way, but not about powers. So it's just an interesting thing for me to take it up from this point of view, especially given the dates and the other people that I associate it with. But I think you're right. Normally, I would never have raised that. And that's also part of it. In fact, I would have absolutely avoided talking about it in ethnic terms. And have. So it's interesting to think of my own. That's partly when I'm saying that about him, but even so, it's an easy thing to say. But 1950, 1948, I mean, it's just an amazing sublimation.
Yeah.
Once you sort to deal with that, and then, Fiedler and Trilling writing about Huck Finn, I mean, it's, it's very striking that was, now I'm not I really don't put myself in either of their. I also want to acknowledge, when I went to Buffalo, just 2 years later, there's an incredible Boundary 2 article. It's very important about Fiedler's attack on the Rosenbergs, which is very upsetting to me because I have a lot of identification with the Rosenbergs. I know that Julius Rosenberg, did some crazy things, but certainly not Ethel. And then Roy Cohn, it's very much related to Trump. So this very terrible attack that Don writes about is part of that history too. I just don't go into it. I want to acknowledge Don is here, and I was very with it.
But don't you think too, there's always a double mark that's at work, in which, yeah. Fiedler's discussion of the Rosenbergs, he's also, I think, generating a code, which he's talking about the ways in which subjection of Ethel to capital punishment generated a whole series of interconnections that he was condemning at the same time as he seemed to be imposing the Rosenbergs. There seems to be a double logic.
Right, well,
in that.
I think there's a double logic, that's what I'm also saying. And the one place I pick up on it, as if I'm a psychoanalyst, is piety, the double sense of the word piety as being a good thing, which has which is resonance or depth, and also his condemning. And I think, yes, it's all about. Bruce asked me before, anxiety. You feel anxiety about identity, and there it is to see Trilling is taking on the issue of, just doesn't name it. And then of course with Bloom, which is that I'm not reading the whole Eliot After Strange Gods quote, which is a frightening quote, and what the implications of that is about free thinking Jews. That's where free thinking comes in. The problem with free thinking Jews. I'm not in any way interested in judging my father, although I certainly was when I was alive. Easy to say now, or Lionel Trilling, or Leslie Fiedler. I have not had to assimilate and deal with the ambivalence that they had, and I didn't go through the Second World War. So I think a lot of us, certainly Jewish leftists, not thought of in that way, we're very much aware of that when we were involved in protests in 68, 69 in the university. Sure, but do you think I'm not that I'm more interested in thinking about that generation than saying,
Do you think that more was at stake in selecting Huckleberry Finn and Jim at that moment, which
well, I don't want to put Jonathan on the spot, but this is, what do you think about that? Was he right? He's written an entire.
Would you also?
I think it's conscious, but I think it's.
I'm asking about what's unstated in that.
Yeah, well, I think what's unstated, I say it earlier on. It says, what is the raft? That's why I go back to the raft, and I would say definitely, I know. Raft is. The raft is a non-national, non-ethnocentric space of imagination. I call it poetry, but you could call it critical intelligence.
But do you think, I'm just wondering, do you think that's also a moment in which critics of the status of Trilling and Fiedler and Howe are also talking about the relationship between African Americans and Jews?
Well, of course, yeah. Like I said, I think it's certainly, though it's not marked, and that's an interesting fact. It's not stated, but I think it's.
So
I think it's projection, yes. If that's not
so the problem cannot be marked, because if it were marked, this would be the free thinking Jews of your generation are allowing themselves,
right.
With radical black students, etc. This would be, it cannot be marked. This is why.
Well, it can't be, cannot is an interesting term, but I would say surely for those two people.
Well, if it's marked, they would then whatever the psychical.
No, it can't be thought. See, I think. But from a way. Yeah, but I think it's repressed, so it's not like a decision that's being made. I'm not going to do that. There were many other people who were certainly wished to put forward within a Trotskyist conception and so on, the struggles of Black people and subaltern people and Jews. I mean, it wasn't an unknown view. It was, of course, and it's not that that's unproblematic too, especially, you know, as it came later in the 60s, that identification is and remains fraud. And that's why I get into some of the other essays. But it's striking that in 1948, you know, that occurs.
Although the thing I came to think when rereading my own discussion some years later was that it's not accidental that free-thinking Jews should choose to love a book that is such a savage critique of American Christianity.
Sure, absolutely. Or yes, or of some space, yeah, right, outside. But I mean, I do think beyond that, you know, as you've been reading about Huckleberry Finn, you know, it's about slavery. I mean, it's, that Jim is not recognized as a person. And it's, you can't read, I don't think that book's readable now, I suppose, within a curricular context for good reason, but I mean, you address that in a book, but it's, so, you know, what do you do in the fact that your ethnic, your group of people were exterminated? And then you see Jim as somebody who is in this precarious state of, in a culture in which he's being hunted down and would be lynched, you know. I don't think that situations are the same by any means. I just think that how you can kind of, let me just, we'll go to dinner, but the last thing is just very short, and it's a translation of a kind of poem that's very important to me, and it's Gedächtnisvier. Vier, how do you say that? And this is actually Zukowski, who I read about otherwise, it's very important to me, has this in his poem Against the Wasteland, poem beginning no one to say Kaddish for me. That is to say, when Zukowski, I mean, Zukowski writes so much about this issue that I see that as a model. But Zukowski says once you read They're Done, and you know, once you get into the English canon, then your mother doesn't recognize you. And also that no one to say Kaddish for me. So it's and Heine is, of course, you know, a very important figure for all of that, is a figure of fundamental you know, irony and ambivalence and in-betweenness. So I translated that as memorial. No mass will anyone sing, no Kaddish will anyone say, neither said nor sung by none when I'm done. But maybe one day when the weather's bright and gay, out for a stroll in Montmartre, my Paulina alongside Mademoiselle Christina, with garlands of evergreen comes she to adorn my grave and sigh, oh, my poor guy, wet melancholy in her eye. Alas, 'twill I way too high, that even for my sweet, a stool I can't supply. Geez, her weary, wobbling feet. Sweetie, fatty, don't go back to your house by foot. At the curb, grab a cab.
It's worth reading the German first.
Yeah, well, it's actually quite close to the German in its own way.
Not quite a tone.
Well, no, not the tone, right? But you know, that tone is there.
Yes.
So, thanks very much.
That, such one.
Well, that's